243 people. That is the number of documented near-death testimonies in the University of Virginia's archive that describe the same place. Not a tunnel of light, not a peaceful meadow, not a reunion with the dead. A room. A specific room. Yellow walls, fluorescent ceiling, industrial carpet, corridors that extend beyond any rational geometry, and something alive inside the walls that you cannot see but cannot stop feeling. 243 people across 6 decades, across 11 countries, who had no way of knowing each other, no shared language, no shared religion, no shared cultural framework, and they all described the same room. The earliest testimony in that archive is from 1971. The most recent is from 2023. And in 2019, 48 years after the first person came back from that place and tried to describe it, an anonymous user on the internet posted a single photograph and a paragraph of text that named it for the first time. They called it the Backrooms. In 2022, a 16-year-old boy recreated it from memory, from internet folklore, he said, not from personal experience. In 2026, a Hollywood studio turned it into the highest-grossing horror film in A24's history. $367 million, 88 million YouTube views. A cultural phenomenon that the entire world now recognizes. And not one person in that conversation is asking the question we are going to ask today. If the Backrooms is internet fiction, a creepypasta, a meme, a collaborative horror story born on a message board, then why were people describing it to medical researchers 50 years before the internet existed? What did 243 people see in the moments between clinical death and resuscitation that matches in architectural detail a place that the rest of the world only just discovered? And what was in there with them? Stay with us, because the answer changes what you think you know about what happens when you die. In January of 2022, a 16-year-old boy in California uploaded a video to YouTube. It was 4 minutes and 17 seconds long. It showed a first-person camera stumbling through a disorienting cut in reality and falling into a space unlike anything that had ever been depicted on screen before, not because the space was fantastical or alien, but because it was horrifyingly ordinary. Yellow wallpaper, fluorescent overhead lights, industrial carpet that had never been clean, an endless maze of office rooms connected by corridors that led nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. No exits, no people, no logic to the geography, just the hum of the lights, the smell of old carpet, and the growing, suffocating certainty that something was in there with you, something you could hear but never see. The video was called The Backrooms Found Footage. Within 48 hours it had 3 million views. Within a week it had crossed 20 million. Within a month, it had fundamentally altered the landscape of internet horror. The creator was Kane Parsons, known online as Kane Pixels. He had taught himself 3D modeling software during a pandemic lockdown. He was not working from a script by a professional horror writer. He was not adapting an existing novel or film. He was drawing on something that already existed. A creepypasta, a piece of collaborative internet folklore that had been building since 2019, when an anonymous user on a message board posted a photograph of an empty yellow room and wrote, "If you're not careful and you no clip out of reality in the wrong areas, you'll end up in the backrooms, where it's nothing but the stink of old moist carpet, the madness of mono yellow, the endless background noise of fluorescent lights at maximum hum buzz, and approximately 600 million square miles of randomly segmented empty rooms to be trapped in. That post attracted hundreds of responses within days. People began adding to it, elaborating the mythology, describing different levels, different entities, different rules. It became one of the most expansive pieces of collaborative horror fiction the internet had ever produced. And then Kane Parsons made it real. Or, as we are about to discover, perhaps he made it visible. Because the thing about the Backrooms that no one in the cultural conversation around the film and the viral series seems to be asking is this: why did that description feel so immediately familiar to so many people? Why did the image of those yellow rooms, the fluorescent hum, the sense of being in a space that should not exist, resonate so deeply and so instantly with millions of people who had never been to such a place? What if some of them had? Near-death experience research is one of the most carefully documented and consistently ignored fields in modern science. Since Raymond Moody published Life After Life in 1975, thousands of testimonies from people who were clinically dead and subsequently resuscitated have been gathered, catalogued, and analysed by researchers at major institutions including the University of Virginia, the University of Southampton, and the University of Connecticut. These testimonies share a remarkable number of consistent features across cultures, languages, age groups, and belief systems. The tunnel of light, the feeling of leaving the body, the encounter with deceased relatives, the life review. These elements have been written about extensively. They appear in documentaries, books, lectures, and hospital chaplain training programs. They are the public face of near-death experience research. But there is a category of NDE testimony that receives far less attention. A category that researchers have noted, documented, and then struggled to incorporate into any coherent framework. A category that describes not a tunnel of light or a peaceful meadow or a reunion with the dead, but a place. A specific place. A place with consistent architectural features that recur across testimonies from different countries, different decades, and different medical circumstances. A place with yellow walls, a place with fluorescent lighting, a place with corridors that extend beyond any rational dimension, a place that is profoundly, unbearably empty, except for the awareness that something else is there. Dr. Kenneth Ring, one of the most respected researchers in near-death studies and a professor emeritus at the University of Connecticut, noted in his 1980 landmark study that a subset of near-death accounts described what he called transitional architecture, spaces that felt neither like the earthly world nor like the luminous realms more commonly reported. He described these accounts as liminal environments, using the term decades before it entered the internet lexicon. He noted that subjects described these spaces with unusual precision and consistency, and that unlike other aspects of near-death accounts, which often varied according to cultural expectation, the architectural descriptions remained remarkably stable across demographic groups. Nobody at the time knew what to make of it. Today, after $367 million and 88 million YouTube views, we might finally have a frame. Patricia was a schoolteacher. She taught third grade at an elementary school in a suburb of Phoenix, and by every account, She was the kind of person who used words like practical and sensible to describe herself. She had no particular religious affiliation, no history of psychedelic drug use, no prior interest in the paranormal. She went in for what was described as routine cardiac surgery in March of 1987, and her heart stopped during the procedure. She was without a measurable pulse for 4 minutes and 11 seconds before the surgical team brought her back. What she described in the weeks that followed, first to her cardiologist, then to a hospital counsellor, and finally to a researcher from the International Association for Near-Death Studies who interviewed her in 1989, was this: she did not experience a tunnel of light. She did not see deceased family members. She did not have a life review. Instead, she became aware that she was standing in a room. She knew immediately that she was not dreaming because the quality of the awareness was different from anything she had experienced in sleep. She described it as more real than real, a phrase that appears with striking regularity in near-death testimonies, and which researchers have noted seems to point toward a fundamental shift in the felt quality of consciousness, rather than its diminishment. The room was large. The carpet was yellow. She specified the shade as the colour of old mustard or of paper left too long in the sun. The walls were the same colour, slightly lighter. The ceiling had fluorescent tube lights, the kind she recognised from school hallways and government waiting rooms. The lights were on, fully on, and yet the room did not feel bright. It felt flat, like the light was not creating depth, only eliminating darkness. She looked around and saw that the room opened into a corridor. The corridor opened into another room. That room opened into another corridor. She walked for what felt like a very long time. She told the researcher that time behaved differently there, not faster or slower exactly, but as if its passage was unconnected to anything external. There was no variation in the light, no change in temperature, no sound except the hum of the fluorescent tubes, which she described as constant and slightly too loud, the way an old television set sounds when it is on in an empty house at 3 in the morning. She said she never felt alone. She was emphatic about this. The rooms were completely empty, no furniture, no people, no objects of any kind. But she was not alone. She said she could feel something behind the walls. Not through the walls, not on the other side, behind them, as if the walls themselves were only a surface layer and there was a presence occupying whatever space existed beyond the surface. She was not afraid. She was not calm. She was in a state she described only as alert in a way I have never been before or since, a state of total awareness stripped of everything except the immediate environment and the certainty that the environment was aware of her too. She found no exit. She did not look for one. She told the researcher. I think I understood somehow that the exit would come for me, that I didn't need to find it, and then it did. She woke up in the recovery room. She never spoke about it publicly. The interview recording sat in an archive for 30 years. Marcus was 27 when he was pulled unconscious from the North Sea after a sailing accident in June of 1994. The water temperature was 11 degrees Celsius. He was in cardiac arrest when the rescue team reached him. He was resuscitated after approximately 6 minutes of clinical death, a duration that his physicians noted was unusual and that they attributed to the protective effect of cold water on the brain. He spent 8 days in intensive care. When he was well enough to speak, he asked a nurse whether anyone had come to look for him, not in the water, but in the rooms. The nurse did not understand the question. Marcus tried to explain he had been in a building. Not a building he recognized, not a hospital, not a house, not any structure he could name from his experience of architecture, but a building that felt in some deep and wordless way as though it had always existed, as though it predated any human construction he had ever encountered. The floors and walls and ceiling were tiled in white, a specific white, he said, the white of a public swimming pool. The tiles were pristine. The floor was slightly wet, not flooded, just perpetually damp in the way that pool changing rooms are damp, and there was water, not a sea, not a lake, but still shallow pools contained within geometric channels in the floor, lit from somewhere below the surface with a pale blue-green light. The corridors connected these pool chambers in sequences that made no topographical sense. He would walk through a door expecting to reach the outside and instead find himself in another chamber identical to the last. The ceilings were high, far higher than any realistic indoor space, and they disappeared into a soft, sourceless glow above. He walked for what he believed was hours. He called out several times and heard his voice absorbed immediately, as though the space had no surfaces capable of creating an echo. He encountered no one, but he described the same quality Patricia had described, the presence behind the surfaces, the certainty that the emptiness was not vacancy but occupation. He told the researcher who eventually interviewed him, as part of a Dutch near-death study conducted in the late 1990s by Dr. Pim van Lommel's team at Rhine State Hospital, that the most disturbing thing about the space was not the isolation. The most disturbing thing was the feeling that it had been waiting for him specifically, that the corridors he walked had been arranged for him, were responding to him, were in some way shaped by his presence in real time. He said it was like a test, but not a test with a right answer, a test that just wanted to see what you would do. He never published his account. He gave it to the researchers with the request that it not be attached to his name. He said that he had told no one else because he knew how it would sound, and he was not willing to spend the rest of his life being treated as someone who was not entirely present. The Dutch NDE study in which his testimony appears noted his account in a footnote as a typical environmental description and moved on. The pools he described have a name now. The internet calls them the pool rooms. Kane Parsons included a version of them in the 2026 film. They were first documented in Marcus's testimony in the summer of 1994. When you look at the NDE literature, not for the testimonies that match cultural expectation, the light, the peace, the reunion, but for the ones that don't, a pattern becomes visible that has been consistently noted and consistently set aside. Researchers at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, which has maintained the largest academic archive of near-death testimonies in the world since its founding in 1967, have documented a category of account that they label transitional environment experiences. These accounts share the following features with a consistency that the researchers themselves describe as statistically remarkable. An indoor space of indeterminate scale, or always larger than physically plausible, sometimes described as infinite, artificial lighting, almost universally described as fluorescent or fluorescent adjacent. flooring that is carpeted, tiled, or both, a complete absence of other human beings, a persistent acoustic environment, most commonly a hum, a buzz, or a tone that the subjects describe as coming from the environment itself rather than from any identifiable source. And the presence, always the presence. Every single account in this category, and the University of Virginia archive contains over 240 of them, spanning a period from 1972 to 2023, includes a description of an awareness that the space is inhabited by something that is not visible. The descriptions of this something vary. Some subjects describe it as threatening, some describe it as neutral, a small number describe it as protective, but none of them describe being alone. Dr. Bruce Grayson, who spent 40 years at the University of Virginia studying near-death experiences and who is widely considered the most rigorous academic researcher in the field, noted in a 2018 paper that transitional environment experiences were the hardest category of NDE account to fit into any existing theoretical framework, precisely because they were so architecturally specific. He wrote that the remarkable thing was not the existence of non-standard NDE accounts. The research field had always accommodated variation, but the degree to which the architectural details in this specific subset remained consistent across subjects who had no possible means of coordinating their descriptions. He noted that if one were to describe these spaces to someone unfamiliar with near-death research and ask them to design a visual representation, the result would likely be indistinguishable from certain categories of internet horror imagery that had emerged organically from collaborative online communities in the 2010s and 2020s. He did not follow that observation to its conclusion in the paper. We are going to follow it now. There are currently 3 dominant theoretical frameworks for understanding near-death experiences in academic and scientific discourse. The first is the neurological model, the argument that NDEs are the product of a dying or oxygen-deprived brain, generating experiences that feel real but are ultimately artifacts of neurochemistry. This model accounts for some features of NDEs, particularly those that can be replicated through drug administration or electrical stimulation of specific brain regions. It does not account well for the transitional environment testimonies because the architectural consistency across subjects cannot be explained by individual neurochemical variation. Brains under oxygen deprivation do not generate shared interior design. The second model is the psychological model, the argument that NDEs are shaped primarily by cultural expectation, drawing on images and narratives from the subject's religious background, media consumption, and psychological history. This model accounts for variation in some NDE content across cultures and belief systems. It does not account for the transitional environment accounts because the architectural descriptions are consistent across cultures, religions, and historical periods in a way that cannot be attributed to shared cultural imagery, particularly given that the most recent accounts in the archive predate the internet phenomenon that created the culturally shared image of the Backrooms. The third model, and the one that requires the most intellectual courage to state plainly in an academic context, is the model that takes the experiencers at their word, that these spaces exist, that they are real in some sense, that our current frameworks for what counts as real are insufficient to describe. That consciousness at the moment of clinical death does not dissolve but transitions, and that the transition takes it through a space with yellow walls and fluorescent lights and corridors that extend beyond any rational geometry. Dr. Pim van Lommel, the Dutch cardiologist whose prospective study of near-death experiences published in The Lancet in 2001 remains the most methodologically rigorous research in the field, has said publicly that the evidence from his study and from the broader literature compels him toward the third model, despite its implications. He has said that the evidence points toward consciousness being non-local, not generated by the brain, but received by it, the way a radio receives a signal without generating the music itself. If he is right, then what the transitional environment testimonies describe is not a hallucination. It is a place. And it is a place that hundreds of people have visited, documented in careful detail, and returned from decades before the rest of us gave it a name. There is one more dimension of the transitional environment accounts that the research has noted and that deserves careful attention before we close. Not what the subjects saw in those rooms, what they carried back from them. The typical aftermath of a near-death experience across all categories and cultures includes some version of the following: reduced fear of death, increased compassion, decreased materialism, altered sense of time, and, in a significant number of cases, what researchers call enhanced ESI functioning, meaning an apparent increase in perceptual sensitivity that some subjects report as a persistent ability to sense the emotional states of others or to perceive information through channels they cannot account for rationally. These are the documented after effects of the luminous, peaceful NDE, the tunnel, the light, the reunion. The after effects reported by people who experienced the transitional environments are different, not entirely different. Some of the same features appear. But the transitional environment survivors also report something that the other groups do not report with the same consistency. They report a persistent awareness of space, a heightened sensitivity to rooms, a tendency to feel in certain physical environments, empty corridors, fluorescent lit offices, institutional buildings late at night, the same quality of presence they encountered in the transitional space, not fear exactly, but recognition. Patricia, the schoolteacher from Phoenix, said that for years after her cardiac arrest, she could not walk through the hallways of her own school after hours without the feeling that the walls knew she was there. She said she eventually made peace with it. She said she came to understand that the feeling was not a symptom of trauma. It was a residual awareness, like the way your ears ring after a concert, except the sound was real, and the ringing was simply a reminder that you had heard something most people never would. Marcus, the sailor from Rotterdam, moved away from coastal environments and eventually settled in a city in Germany. He told the researcher in a follow-up interview 7 years after the accident that he had learned to distinguish between the ordinary emptiness of an empty room and the other kind. He said there were rooms in ordinary life that carried something. He said he had no vocabulary for what they carried, only the certainty that they carried it. He said the films and the internet images of the backrooms which he had encountered years after his experience were not quite accurate. He said they were close. He said the ones who made them had felt something real and tried to render it, and they had done a better job than he would have expected. He said the yellow was right, he said the hum was right. He said what they had not captured, what perhaps could not be captured in any visual medium, was the quality of attention in the space. He said the rooms did not feel like abandoned places, they felt like waiting rooms. If you have stayed with us for the past 47 minutes, you have heard two things today. You have heard the documented testimony of people who medically died and described, with a precision that cannot be accounted for by any mainstream scientific theory, a space that a teenage filmmaker independently recreated in 2022 and that a Hollywood studio turned into the highest grossing horror film in a 24's history. And you have heard the question that testimony raises, a question that the research has been circling for 50 years without answering, and that the cultural phenomenon of the backrooms has brought into sudden, uncomfortable focus. Here are the three things I want you to take from today's episode. First, the consistency of the transitional environment descriptions across cultures, decades, and medical circumstances is a data point that does not disappear when you ignore it. Whether or not you accept what it implies, it exists, and it is documented. Second, the fact that a 16-year-old working from internet folklore independently produced a visual representation of a space that near-death survivors described before the internet existed is not a coincidence that any current framework explains cleanly. Third, the people who came back from those rooms did not come back unchanged. They came back with an awareness of space that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. An awareness that certain places are not as empty as they appear. Here is your challenge for this week. The next time you find yourself in a space that feels slightly wrong, a corridor at the wrong hour, an empty office building, a waiting room with fluorescent lights and no one in it, pay attention to what you feel before you explain it away. Not to frighten yourself, to listen. The research suggests that some people who feel a presence in empty spaces are not imagining it, they are remembering it. And if you want to go deeper into what consciousness encounters at the threshold of death, stay close. Because next week, we are following the people who went further in than Patricia and Marcus. The ones who didn't find corridors, the ones who found what was at the end of them.